All right, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us here in the third week of our series on some of the economic impacts of the coronavirus here in Montana. Got another big group today, and thanks everybody for participating and sharing where you're from. It looks like we've got some participation today from a pretty widespread swath across Montana, so that's great to see. So appreciate you taking the time to share with us there. A couple notes today before we get started with our speakers. First of all, 1 week from today, same time on a Thursday at 2, we'll have another 3 speakers for you. And this time we're going to have 3 folks from the MSU Department of Agricultural Economics and Economics. And we're going to talk about some labor issues primarily. So Chris Stoddard is going to talk about moving forward, some possible outcomes for workers and the economy. Carly Urban will talk about unemployment, volume projections, and some policy responses in that sense. And then Diane Charlton is going to talk about immigration and specifically how that impacts the agricultural workforce, not just in Montana, but for the U.S. at large. We have also decided to extend the series for 1 more week, at least. So on April 30th, there will also be a session, and we'll announce speakers for that here shortly as well. So there will be a 5th week on April 30th. It's not on your original flyer, but we'll be adding that information in the coming days here about what April 30th will be. We have posted all of our recordings of the last 2 sessions on this website here that you're seeing there on your screen. And we also will keep the schedule for any upcoming sessions as well. So if you're wondering what's coming on April 30th, probably on Monday we'll be updating that and adding the schedule for April 30th as well. So keep those 2 resources in mind if you haven't already done so. Now, in terms of technology today, if you have questions, please send them in that question and answer pod. I will watch for those, and when the speaker finishes their talk, or if they get to kind of a natural break, I'll go ahead and ask those to the presenter along the way. So please send them in. They are anonymous. Nobody else is going to know who asked the question, so feel free to send it in, and we'll see if we can get as many of those answered as we can today, if time allows there. So our first speaker today, I'll jump 2 slides ahead there, is going to be a faculty member in the Department of Agricultural Economics and Economics, and that's Eric Belasco, and he works on a lot of different livestock issues. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Eric, and then we'll monitor some questions and make sure he gets those to him at the end of his presentation. So it's all yours, Eric.
All right. Thank you, Joel. Thank you for everyone attending. And I guess I just want to say thanks to Joel and Kate for putting together these sessions. I actually went back and listened to the last couple weeks, and I've enjoyed the sort of diversity of speakers, the different viewpoints on what the impact of COVID has been on Montana. And I look forward to next week's too, to hear more about labor, because I think as we go throughout today, one of the things that will be one of the ongoing themes is that labor is sort of one of the biggest uncertainties in the agricultural markets. And so I look forward to starting off today. I'm going to talk specifically about the cattle market. And so I'm just going to start just by kind of illustrating what I would call the main points, and then I'll try to walk through these main points. But I think these are the points that I hope to make today. The first is that all commodity prices have suffered kind of to varying degrees. The cattle market has especially been hit. Live and feeder cattle markets, we've seen quick declines in those markets. And so first thing I'll do is try to put it into perspective amongst other commodities, as well as what we've seen kind of in the longer run in the cattle market. How does this stack up with recent history? Second point, and I think, for me right now, someone who watches the futures markets, the volatility is kind of off the charts. In terms of price levels, these prices aren't necessarily out of the bounds of what we've seen, but there's a lot of volatility, meaning there's a lot of uncertainty as to where prices are going to go from here. Third, and I think this is kind of the biggest bit of confusion, at least in the cattle market, is that you see sort of this simultaneous increase in the price of wholesale beef and reductions to cattle. And I think that's sort of been unsettling, especially if you're trying to sell cattle. It puts you in an odd spot. But it's this ratio between at home and away from home purchases, which I think has really sort of moved the system around in ways that we're not really used to. I do think that is, I mean, that is not just I think, but that seems to be a very temporary shock. And I think the duration of that largely depends on the labor situation. Major concerns going forward. And I guess there are three sort of things that I guess right now I don't really know, but things that I'm looking at. First one is supply disruptions. And we've seen, and I'll talk more about this, but we've seen a lot of supply disruptions in the pork industry. We've seen some in meat packing plants. But just how far out will these supply disruptions go? When will they be mitigated? Second, the severity of the future recession. And so what happens sort of when the dust clears? Where is unemployment? We know that there is a pretty strong relationship between income, disposable income, and purchases toward beef products. And then third, I don't know what to say about trade. Will at the end of this, will we come out and have better relations with other countries? Will we be more ambitious with setting trade as a priority, or will it kind of take a backseat? And so that's kind of, I think, creates a lot of uncertainty as well. So I hope to walk through these points in 15 minutes here. So first, just to put cattle prices into context, looking at prices since February 18th here, looking at some of the other products, cotton has been one that has been really effective. So that's the brown line there. We've seen since the middle of February, it's down 22.6%. Live cattle has been hit a little bit harder than that, 22.8% of a fall from mid-February. Feeder cattle also seen reductions of about 16.4%. Soybeans has once kind of already experienced, I guess, some drops before then. Wheat, and I saw prices were changing a little bit today for wheat, but they've been, about even right now. In the feeder cattle market, we can really distinguish between when these contracts are due to take a look at what the expectations are for the market. And what I mean by that is this red line indicates the futures contracts that are due in May. So that price is going to reflect our price expectations for very soon. And then we can look at some of the further out price projections. So November 2020 and also January 2021, just to get an idea for what the market is pricing in, to some of these price declines. And we can definitely see the further in we get, the more the price decrease has been. So for May, we see the most dramatic price decrease. And those price series, if you look at them, they basically move together just in sort of a parallel fashion. So right now, and I think they went up a little bit today, but feeder cattle contracts due in May are down to about 114. You can see that at the beginning of February, they're at 140, so it's quite a drop-off. And then November and January, at least for a lot of the ranchers in Montana, those are the prices that we look at. And if you're looking at those, you're saying, well, yeah, the market is down. It was about 150 in February. Now it's down to 127. So it's down not as dramatically as the May contracts. Okay, to put it in sort of a longer term, we look at the last 20 years and strip out inflation, which actually in this series, inflation has been pretty small over the last 20 years. But we look at the feeder and the fed cattle prices movements, and these are aggregated monthly. So those price decreases are going to be somewhat mitigated through aggregation. But you can see this recent drop just toward the end of this series. Both of them fall off very dramatically. But also the other thing we pay attention to is this feeder-fed price ratio, which tells us sort of the margin that is obtained through feeding and packing, kind of on that, when you're putting on the last bit of weight, where those gains are. And right now, it seems like it's in line. That ratio seems in line with what we've had historically, which is, on the high side if we look at the longer run projections. It's about 25% higher for those feeder cattle prices. I mentioned volatility is high, and so volatility, just keep in mind, doesn't tell us anything about whether prices are going to go up or down. It just says they're going to move. And the volatility that we're seeing right here is upwards of 50%, which is just off the charts for, that's more of something we'd expect for oil markets, not for cattle markets. And so we can see it just happened very quickly. And again, we can look at these different contracts. And for me, this tells me a lot. This says this red line, there's a lot of volatility in those contracts that are in May. We see a lot of that, when we talk about 50%, a lot of that is driven by these early in contracts. So there's a lot of uncertainty in these sales that need to happen over the next couple months. And that could just be because, what are auctions going to look like? What kind of demand factors are going to be there for your cattle? By the time November and January come around, you can see that those the implied volatility measures drop off a bit. And so, again, this suggests that at least that uncertainty is a little bit more dramatic in the very near term, but then kind of levels out as we get further out. So there's a little less confusion about prices, going into next fall. Okay, so moving along to kind of another topic, talking about at home versus away from home. And, I just showed this chart. This is from the USDA, and this is kind of a trend that we've seen over the last, since 1960. We've seen people moving, they consume less at home. They consume less raw products. They eat more out at restaurants, more ready-made products. And one of the things that has happened, at least over the last couple of months, is that consumers have been forced to reverse a lot of those trends. You don't eat out as much. You prepare a lot more food. If you look at the purchases of raw meat products, those have gone up. But, so much of the beef industry relies on, restaurants and preparing kind of those high-end cuts of steak, which, if you're selling through grocers, you could still find those high-end steaks, but, you really find a lot of them in the away from home category of retail. And so we've seen a lot of that reverse. And, I think a really good way to put it was a colleague of mine, Jason Lusk, was our ML Wilson speaker a few years back. He was on the Freakonomics podcast a little while ago, which is a great podcast, especially this topic, what happens when everyone stays home to eat. And I think he put it really well. He said, we're moving inventory from warehouses and grocery stores into our pantries and our refrigerators. So you see a lot of movement from the stores. People are just kind of stocking up. There's some sense that a lot of that is dampening now as we look at some of the wholesale prices. But certainly that was the initial response. And then, beef is especially sensitive to restaurant and fast food purchases. We see beef in so many forms in restaurants and fast food options. And just to kind of illustrate this, and this is, provided by Jason Lusk, compiled data from the USDA, we look at wholesale daily beef prices. And, notice the difference between this plot where we see wholesale beef prices going up and feeder prices and live cattle prices going down. And I think it's hard to kind of wrap your mind around it. There have been some different theories, but I think the most general one is we have kind of this temporary, rush on these raw products at grocery stores, which has driven up this price. Over the last few days, we've seen it kind of come back to more of a normal price level. All right, so now three major concerns, and these are the things that I don't know what is going to happen, but these are the things that I think could have a big impact on the markets. The first is just supply disruptions. Next week we'll be talking about labor, and I look forward to that. In my mind, that's sort of one of the biggest short-term, uncertainties. Is will we be able to deliver product, from the ranch to grocery stores? And it really, the bottleneck is happening at these processing facilities where you need to have a lot of labor. You need to have a lot of labor in relatively close proximity. They're not set up to allow for social distancing and different things that I think we'd like to see in other sectors. And so already we've seen some big, reductions in supply. The plant in South Dakota basically brought in a lot of the cases there. The JBS plant in Greeley closed down. And the hope is that these are temporary. As long as they're temporary, they have been able to shift the supplies to other areas. But obviously, if this becomes a prolonged issue in these processing facilities, then that presents some major risk factors to the beef sector. And just to kind of illustrate, again, this was provided by Jason Lusk, and the April figures here are estimated. But we see, if we compare the cattle slaughter data, we can see a fall off from this year compared to last year. So the dotted blue line is 2019, and the red line is this year. And we can see, where those started to happen. Hog has been a bit more pronounced, and we've heard a lot more plants closing. That certainly doesn't mean beef plants are immune to, these outbreaks. And so, managing these labor issues, I think, is the largest concern that I have right now in the short term for the beef sector. Concern two is more of a medium-term concern, and that is a possible recession. So we know that beef, in our economics classes, we call it a normal good. It means that consumption of that product tends to move with income. So as people have more disposable income, they purchase more of it, and with less, they purchase less of it. And there are a range of sort of what we call income elasticities. Most of them are around 1.0, but basically what this means is that as income goes down by 1%, we see the same amount of reduction in beef expenditures. And obviously, depending upon the cut of beef, that can change. You might think of like hamburger beef as having a lower elasticity, meaning that it's more of a necessary product, whereas maybe more expensive pieces of beef consumers are more sensitive to, which does put Montana in a hole because, we have always been kind of prided ourselves on those high quality cuts of steak. And those are the ones that are the most sensitive to recessions. And it's not just domestic recessions, also kind of has implications for global recessions. If we see some of this, especially in the Asia Pacific region, where we rely on Japan and South Korea to buy high price cuts of meat, we're going to need to make sure that their incomes are staying there. So that, is a concern kind of more of in the medium term. In the longer term, the trade outlook, and trade is always important for ag. And it's, the hard part is it's not just ag today, but it's ag 20 years from now. How will we position ourselves? And, that's the one thing I've been trying to figure out is, does an event like this, does it bring countries closer together so that when we're done with this, we start cooperating more, or does it sort of keep us more apart? Does it, will it lend itself to new market expansion and new trade negotiations, or isolationism? And I think that's sort of an open question. Our current partners, Japan, Korea, Mexico, and Canada, can we rely on them to continue to purchase in what they've been purchasing before? And really a lot of this relies on incomes in some of these other countries. So, these are kind of the three main concerns that I have. And so with that, I'll just stop and thank you all and look forward to your questions.
Yeah, if you've got some questions, thanks, Eric, for that. I'll pause here for just a minute. Please send those questions in that question and answer pod here, and we'll try to get those over to Eric. We did have one question come in, Eric, and that question is about for Montana cattle producers that are thinking about marketing calves in October and November. Do you have any thoughts about what market volatility might do between now and October, November timeframe?
Yeah, I mean, so what we're seeing today says that it's much better to be selling in October, November than to be selling in May. And I know there are, some spring sales, but what we're seeing in the market so far are, and if we go back to, first we see the feeder cattle price is anticipating a higher price, some kind of a price increase between now and then. And I think some of that is assuming that a lot of these measures will be, will kind of be on the back end of a lot of what's happening right now. But the other thing is kind of the volatility. So the volatility, by the time we get to January, November, right now, and that's a bit high, it's still a bit high, it's above 20%. Kind of average market volatility we think of as being about 16%. We're looking over 20%. So it is elevated, but it's slightly elevated. The May volatility, 50%. If you were looking to sell in May, I wouldn't know what to tell you, but, November, it might, the markets at least are suggesting that it'll be a better time to sell. Higher prices and a little bit more stability is anticipated.
All right, thanks, Eric. After a bit of a slow start, the questions have started flowing in here. So let me tackle a couple here. One, what percentage of Montana cows are processed out of state?
That's a good question. I don't have the exact number, but I know it's 90 some percent are moving out of the state. And so, a lot of what we see in these plants in Greeley, really, that's where a lot of our calves eventually are headed. And so, we would like to see good working conditions, limited outbreaks in some of those areas.
All right, thanks. Let's do one more question, then we'll move on to our next speaker. And if we have time at the end, we'll come back. What are you hearing about dairy cow buyouts to help stabilize the dairy industry, and how will that affect the cull cow and ground beef markets?
That's a good. I don't want to speculate too much on the dairy industry buyouts. I guess I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that question. That's a really good question, though.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Eric. And if you're going to hang around till the end here, we may come back and ask a few more questions to you at the very end today. Let's move along here and get our second speaker introduced. Dr. Anton Beckerman, also a faculty member in MSU's Department of Agricultural Economics, and he's going to talk a little more specifically here with us about crop markets and kind of some implications there as well.
All right. Well, thanks for having me, Joe, and thanks, Eric, for your presentation. I'm going to switch it up to crops and see where that market is. Just to kind of give you a big picture overview, this is what I'm going to talk about in much more detail. Number one, the nature of the disruption and the way the consumers are behaving is definitely affecting crop markets in the U.S. very differently. And I think that is really important to think about as we move forward with this pandemic and see how long it lasts, and then following on the economic ramifications of the pandemic. Crop markets, they're usually experiencing supply shocks, right? Droughts, wet seasons, wildfires, whatever. The coronavirus impacts are different because they're coming from the demand side. And so the way that, again, consumers are behaving and the way that markets are responding are also going to be slightly different. And again, we have to keep that in mind. Now, how this is going to impact the farm sector is going to involve many factors, but three of the ones that certainly I've been thinking about and I think are pretty obvious within the supply chain that Dr. Brester is going to talk about in the next presentation are logistics, the trade, and government interventions. Those three factors will certainly be key to understanding how we move forward in the next several years. And then one thing that I do want to touch on is the impact on feed crops from this global oil war and the fuel demand and the decline of gasoline demand in the United States. And I think that may have some pretty major implications for feed crops, especially. And as I'll show you in a second, the feed crops and the crops for human consumption, we really have to look at those quite differently in this particular situation. So let me jump right into a similar graph that Eric showed, but this is just showing crops. So this is changes in commodity prices of crops from January 1, 2020, and this is percentage changes. So above that dotted line at 0.0%, that means that prices are higher than January 1, below is lower. And what you can see is things are different. This is not the typical way that ag commodity prices move. Typically, we think of them moving together in relatively parallel ways, that if everything goes up or down, but we rarely see these kind of divergent movements. And that's exactly what we see happening in these markets. So you can see that corn and cotton and soybeans, they've really taken a dive. Corn is down 15% relative to January 1, cotton very similar. On the other hand, the wheat and rice is, winter wheat is above that 0% line. Rice is way above it. Spring wheat was kind of trending downward and then turned back up right when this disaster started to occur in mid to late February. And so there is a story, I think, behind this divergent movement. And the story is that, again, this is a different animal. This is not the typical supply shock or even a global inventory shock or stock shock that we typically think about in these markets. And that's, I think, part of the reason that we see this divergence. So why is this happening? So this is a very similar graph that Eric showed for beef, but this is actually for all spending. I got this courtesy of the New York Times. I guess I didn't tell the New York Times that I'm using it, but I did cite them. And what you can see, this is since early January, consumer spending based on credit and debit card expenditures on various goods. And clearly, once the pandemic entered the U.S. and things started to evolve very quickly, and especially when the national emergency was declared, we see groceries, those staple goods that people want to buy and hold in case things become even worse. The expenditures on those goods go up quite quickly. Now they've dropped as we've accumulated in households those particular food items, but everything else certainly is going downward, partly because there's restrictions, but partly because there is uncertainty and fear that we are heading into an economic recession if we're not already there. So that's certainly part of the reason, and how this impacts particularly crop markets and particularly crops that are used for human consumption. This is a great example that illustrates human behavior and consumer behavior. So this is Google searches for 4 phrases: bread recipes, muffin recipes, flour recipes, and pizza dough recipes. All things that you can make with flour. And this is a Google search. So this is an index of how often these particular phrases are being searched on Google. And what you can see happen in March, at the beginning of March, when the national emergency was declared, is through the roof increases in phrases like, what are bread recipes? What are flour recipes? What are pizza dough recipes, right? Muffins. And so, well, you need inputs to make those things. Those inputs are flour, right? Wheat-based products. And so what we see is when we have this pandemic increase and the ramifications of that increase really impacting households are going to respond by buying more of the staples and diverting some of their activities like biking and shopping for non-food goods, and they're going to do things that they can perform at home, like baking or making homemade beer or whatever. That's, I guess, what I've been doing, baking and making beer. So this is a pretty good indication and a pretty interesting indication of how consumers have reacted, how crop markets may be. But of course, the big question is this just a short-run dynamic, right? We saw in the previous graph that we had this spike in grocery purchases, but then maybe a beginning of a decline. And, this is, we want to know as producers, as folks in the supply chain, whether this is just a short-run dynamic, this increase in demand for those goods, or if this is something that's a medium run or long run. And now the past is not a perfect predictor of the future. Otherwise, I would bet all my money on stock markets and be very rich right now. But there could be some lessons that we could learn, and one lesson in particular might be from 2008, which is when we had, as a country and as a world, the last really big recession. And in recessions, what we typically see is a decline in the demand for consumable goods, which does include food. And so, again, this is a graph that you've seen before in maybe other presentations, but this is showing the expenditure on food purchased for home consumption and food away from home. And what we could see happen is through the 2000s and late 90s, both of those lines are upward trending. And then right around 2008, we see those two bars going downward. And that's when the recession happened. And what we see happening is those two bars, after the recession has ended, they don't rebound immediately back to where we were in pre-recession levels. And what we also see is differential movements upward after the recession concluded. So what we can see is food away from home, restaurant food and bar food, that rebounded much more quickly. It rebounded about 2.5 years back to pre-recession levels. But for food at home, that took quite a bit more time, 5 to 6 years to return to pre-recession levels. So this could be at least some indicator that when we have the recession, and depending on how long it lasts and how devastating it is, we could see quite a bit of time before things come back in that consumer market, which then trickles down to the agricultural production sector through the demand and supply chain. So again, this is an indicator of what happened in the past. Can it be used to perfectly predict what is going to happen now? Absolutely not. But at least it gives us some indicators, some signals of how long the impacts of this particular pandemic and the economic implications might last. There are very few estimates right now of the impact of COVID-19 on agricultural markets. This is one of the few that I've seen. This is pretty recent, out of FAPRI, which is an agricultural think tank between the University of Missouri and Iowa State University. And what they do is they come up with bi-yearly forecasts of agricultural markets, and I just focused on crop markets here. And on a couple of days ago, on April 11th, they came out with an update running models based on what might happen with the COVID-19 and the resulting economic recession. And so these are comparing those estimates that they made back in August to estimates that they've updated based on the economic activity that has been impacted by the coronavirus. So this is for the next 2 marketing years, the impact on prices on the left. You can see that the crops that are most impacted in the next 2 marketing years, they're forecasting are corn and cotton. So 2 crops that are not directly used for human consumption. Soybeans is there as well. Wheat, on the other hand, in the next marketing year, doesn't look to be a huge impact on price, and certainly a larger impact on price next year but certainly not to the expense of the impacts of these other crops that are not used. Now, we like to talk about prices because they give us some sense of revenues, and we like revenues a lot more than we like costs. But when you think about net farm incomes, that has to include both the revenue and the cost side of things. And so when we look on the right-hand side, you can see that the impacts on net farm incomes and the changes in billions of dollars, certainly corn is projected to really take the big hit. And we'll talk about why in a second in a few slides, primarily due to ethanol demand declines. But certainly soybeans are going to decline quite a bit by about $2 billion each year relative to the August forecast. Cotton doesn't seem to be as impacted, and wheat isn't impacted as nearly as much as these other crops either. And a lot of that is due to the fact that the input costs for those crops are also going to decrease with the recession. And perhaps on the wheat side, perhaps those farmers have a little bit more flexibility in changing their land allocation. Now, at the very bottom of the slide, I included another interesting fact. I talked about that government interventions might be particularly important. During the next 2 years, when the net farm incomes are declining, at the same time, government payments are increasing by about $2 billion this marketing year, and about $4.5 billion next. So that's certainly going to be a big part in potentially sustaining agricultural operations. Other factors affecting wheat markets, certainly processing capacity and distribution logistics will be important. There are reports coming out every day about milling plants having employees tested with COVID-19. Will we see the same thing happening as we see in meat processing plants where the entire plant is closed? I don't know. There was an interesting article that I read today about automation potentially taking over and doing more of the work that maybe labor has done in the past. And also there are continuing reports of these uneven distributions across the United States. Some consumers are able to access products and some others. So that may trickle down to different parts of the United States where those products are produced at the Trade will also continue to be important. Global inventories for wheat are already at record highs, but a lot of countries are stockpiling like crazy. And those global inventories may not be an indication of demand for wheat on the export market. Russia, as always, will be the wild card. They're the biggest exporter of wheat. They're continuing to stockpile and use up their domestic inventories, and the Ag Ministry in Russia has also indicated and proposed to the president and the prime minister that they should shut down their wheat exports in the next couple of months, especially as that COVID-19 rate is increasing in Russia. But the biggest factor may be the exchange rates. And any time that there's a recession, at least in the past 50, 60 years, countries and investors look to the U.S. dollar. They see the U.S. dollar as the safest investment, and that's where they put their resources. And we see it again this year. So this is an index of the U.S. dollar against other currencies. And since the middle of February, we've seen that U.S. dollar value just skyrocket. And higher U.S. dollar values are not good for U.S. exports because that makes U.S. exports more expensive on the international market. Now it's rebounded a little bit downward, but certainly it is very, very high and would naturally make U.S. ag products less competitive on the global stage. And against, for wheat producing countries, this is what the U.S. dollar has done against major competitors, up 2% against the euro, up 7% against the Canadian dollar, 12% against Australia, and almost 20% against Russia. So again, wheat is becoming less competitive against its major resources, and that may be a big factor in maintaining wheat markets in the next couple of years. Last thing that I want to touch on is this impact of ethanol and oil markets. We've seen this oil war between Russia and OPEC. Instead of cutting supplies, they initially increased their supplies, and that really just the bottom of the market fell through for the oil market in blue, and ethanol followed. Right, ethanol is blended with oil for gasoline production, and that follows. Ethanol prices typically follow oil prices. And also, we're just going to have naturally less demand for gasoline because we're all sitting in place, right? There's shelter in place orders around the country, and consumers and individuals are going to be very uncertain about returning to quote unquote normal life or pre-COVID life very quickly until there's a vaccine. And ethanol plants are just closing up all over the place, and that is really keeping corn prices quite low. And if we don't see a rebound in this market very quickly, this is probably going to impact those feed crops, corn and tangentially soybeans, quite a bit, perhaps for longer than just a few months. Okay, I'll end it there. I'm sure I went over time, unlike Eric, and I'll take some quick questions.
All right. Well, first of all, thanks, Anton. We've had a couple questions come in already. The first one being, why is there such a difference between winter wheat and spring wheat price changes?
That's a really good question. So the two classes have different protein levels. Certainly, they're used for different types of wheat flour that is then used for different output products. One of the things potentially that has been driving winter wheat prices up quite a bit is the fact that back last September, October, winter wheat prices were very, very low. And so plantings were much lower this year. They actually have hit another historical low in terms of the amount of plantings. But because of this increase in consumer demand for wheat and flour-based products, there may be a market under a signal that there isn't as much winter wheat that's expected to be produced, especially the higher quality winter wheat that's produced in Montana and other locations in North America. So that could be driving that quite a bit. The other component that may be driving the difference is that spring wheat is still not planted. We've had some delays in plantings because of the snow and really not conducive weather. And so we still don't quite know how many acres are going to go into spring wheat plantings. And I think the market, at least the futures market, is still kind of deciding where we're going to go. Are we not going to have as many acres, and so the supply may be lower than we would expect, and so prices might go up, or are farmers going to potentially switch land that they allocated to something else a few months ago into spring wheat and produce more of that crop? So I think there's just a little bit less certainty about the production side of spring wheat right now.
All right, Anton, one more quick question before we turn it over to our last speaker. Your focus was on price today, but what do we know about input costs? Presumably fuel prices are down. What about fertilizer and herbicides? Anything on that side of the equation?
Herbicide, I haven't seen too many things that are different. They're going to be different with herbicide. In terms of fertilizer, it's probably going to be lower than maybe 2 or 3 years ago, because we've had quite a bit fewer acres of corn planted last year, and so there is a glut of fertilizer that's out there that hasn't been sold because last year corn acres weren't as high. They were only about 89 million acres of planted corn. This year, corn is expected to be around 97 to 98 million acres. So there is fertilizer availability out there. Now, again, we still don't know what's going to happen to corn acres and wheat acres. And if farmers decide to plant more spring wheat and more corn than anticipated, that could certainly push fertilizer prices up. There is talk on the weather front that we may see similar floods as we saw last year, and everyone, of course, is hoping that that doesn't happen. But if we do see continued delays in plantings and more devastating natural events, that could certainly keep those fertilizer prices lower than everyone decided to plant corn and could plant that corn. So right now, I think prices are reasonable. Certainly, if we continue to fulfill the expectations in the planting reports that have been published by the USDA, those prices may go up.
All right. Thank you very much, Anton, for a presentation and taking the time to address those questions. Let me get our last speaker here set up. All right, so our final speaker, Gary Brester, probably a familiar face to many of you, was a colleague of ours in our department for many years, recently decided to move into kind of semi-retirement, but lucky for us, he's still dabbling before he retired. So Gary's going to talk a little bit on some of the things here about agriculture and some food supply chain issues.
Thank you, Joel. I appreciate the introduction and appreciate Dr. Fuller asking me to join the group today. I really feel like I'm following Drs. Bekkerman and Belasco, and they've said a lot of the things that I was thinking about saying as well, so I'm probably just reiterating something, but to some extent I really appreciated joining them as they're excellent colleagues of mine. When Kate first asked me about doing this talk on supply chains, I said I was sort of uncertain as to what I'd be speaking about, and she promptly told me that I'd given a lot of talks in this state, and people are probably used to me talking about things that I know nothing about. So with her positive support, I decided to go ahead and see if I could add a little bit to this discussion. I wanted to visit, there was just a question about agricultural inputs, talk about our food production sector in general a little bit more about transportation, and a few thoughts about food away from home and grocery store distribution of food products. In terms of the agricultural input sectors, fertilizer, as Anton has said, has actually fallen a little bit in the last few months. This is a futures price for May delivery. A little historically higher price in the spring as a lot of fertilizers being applied. But as Anton mentioned, we have large fertilizer stocks right now, and we've actually seen fertilizer prices probably flat more than anything else, and probably not affected much by the COVID type problems. The herbicide side of things is not incredibly labor intensive, and I'll talk some more about that as Eric did, so probably not a major issue in terms of prices declining there. That's really a matter of what Anton mentioned, demand and how much herbicides will be needed depending upon planted acres. If we think about the diesel fuel prices, they've dropped dramatically. Again, as Anton has mentioned, these are road diesel prices since the start of the year. Field diesel used in tractors is usually 50 to 75% lower. Again, a combination of lower crude oil prices. But on the gasoline side, as you saw a previous graph, gasoline demand is very low. It's mostly why prices for gasoline are at some of the lowest we've seen in, I guess, at least 20 years, maybe a little longer than that. One of my brothers works at the Laurel Oil Refinery, the CHS refinery, and he said they're getting pretty close to having to actually just shut the refinery down. And the reason is they can't move gasoline. Their tanks are full. They've got no place to put the output, which in any refining process includes at least some gasoline, and they're really struggling. Hence, we see a lower gasoline prices overall, along with lower diesel fuel prices. On the plus side, that means more dollars, disposable income in the pockets of those of us who use fuels. In terms of the food production sector, planting activities are certainly occurring. These are more weather impacted than anything else, so we're likely to not see a lot of disruption there as people are able to get their inputs and get them put into the ground. But something we don't think about is, as Eric had mentioned, the labor component of people being in close proximity to each other. While the gentleman or gal that's running that tractor planting corn is isolated, these folks are not. And this is not a seasonal activity. Harvesting vegetable crops, this is the process where most of it is done, and you see a lot of people in very close proximity to each other. So there are some harvesting activities that could certainly be affected by this. By the way, next week when Diane Charlton visits with you folks, she'll be talking about immigration, and a lot of that has to do with the impact on finding people to do that kind of work. In our food processing plants, Eric had mentioned meat processing. I'll come back to that in a second, but we forget how those little packages of spring mix shows up in our grocery stores. This is a lettuce processing facility in California. One of the good things, this involves people clearly, but one of the good things is I've been through these plants, some of them, and the safety situations are very, very strong there. Masks are always worn, gloves, foot baths as you go between one area of the processing facility to another. I'm still marveled, even though after 40 years, I guess, of looking at the agricultural industry, how quickly they can take lettuce harvested in a field, chill it, and have it in your grocery stores within about 48 hours. It's quite a remarkable process. Here is where, as Eric mentioned, the bigger problems are. Much of the meat processing sector is very labor intensive with lots of close proximity. These are workers taking chickens and cutting them up into different chicken parts. But the same goes on in poultry, in pork and beef processing plants as well. Another thing after 40 years I still struggle with our food production system is its scale. Consider that we slaughter 9 billion chickens a year in the U.S. The number boggles my mind, and the quantities are on a scale that most of us simply forget about. One of the things we might be seeing in some of the meat processing plants, and especially in poultry, is less of the parts being disassembled by humans, rather just packaging whole birds up and sending them to market in that fashion. Anton, we might be seeing some Google searches about how to take a chicken apart, because I think a lot of us probably don't know how to do that anymore. In the transportation sector, an incredibly important part of of the food production process, and that's that trucks move food. And we have to be able to have diesel fuel into those trucks. Truck stops have to be open, not just for machine fuel, diesel fuel and oil, but also for people food as well. One of the things I noticed this morning when I was at the grocery store during old people's hours, I guess it's the only advantage of being old, was that there were almost no cut flowers available at the grocery store, and the one I go to usually has that. I very frequently have to buy bouquets of flowers and roses for my wife to get out a certain amount of occasional trouble, and so I'm a frequent purchaser of those flowers, and they're almost non-existent. It's probably the effect of transportation. Flowers have to be cut by hand somewhere, shipped either by air or through ports or through trucks, and they've just taken a back seat now to many other things. So it just, again, as we slow these transportation processes down, there certainly are consequences. In the food away from home sector, again, both the previous speakers have mentioned this. I don't think it hurts to talk about the importance of this sector to those basic commodity prices, especially on the beef side and somewhat to the pork side as well. Back in the 1980s, let me pull a little here down to my little chart here. Back in the 1980s, we had about 55% of our food consumed at home, 45% away from home, and these have switched about even here in the earlier part of this century, and now in this decade we have now more food consumed away from home than at home. If you look at expenditures, These are adjusted for inflation, so we spend more on food. This is that recessionary time that Anton had mentioned, and we see these food expenditures go up. These have gone up because of wealth, because we want better food, more higher quality food, more kinds of food, and for all those reasons, we've seen this food away from home overtaking our food at home in terms of expenditures as well. Now, in terms of thinking about where this food away from home occurs, this sector right here, this full-service restaurants, is where over a third of this food is consumed when it's consumed away from home. And this is the section that's really shut down right now. And to some extent, we also have limited service restaurants being not sit-down restaurants, but a takeout. There's still some takeout going on. There's still some fast food places that are certainly open. The story here, though, is the one that Eric started on, especially for the beef industry, and that is when people both lose income and don't travel as much, both of those things greatly affect the beef side of the market. And so this is an important component, especially for that beef side of this particular market. Why is it so difficult to move food from our basic food service sector into the grocery store sector? And there's all sorts of problems. The food service sector buys tomato sauce in slightly larger quantities than we normally would. These kinds of cans, first of all, can't hardly be used by any single household without a lot of spoilage, and they don't really stack on shelves. The shelves aren't designed for them. So this process of moving from one set of food products to another is difficult, and this includes things such as the way meat products are cut, packaged, and all those sorts of things as well. One of the interesting things that Jason Lusk, which Eric had referred to, whom Eric had referred to, talks about what has actually been left on store shelves as he's gone through stores where there's not a lot of basics left. He said there seems to be a lot of organic foods. There was a question a little earlier. There seems to be a lot of beyond beef sort of meat substitute foods left on the markets. And the reality of it is that when incomes are lower, we just don't have the wealth or are concerned about spending those kind of money on those higher priced goods. And so we're probably going to see a little less of those products moving and more of things that are less expensive, at least for now. If we think then about my last little part here as we're getting close to the end of our time, we think about grocery stores and distribution. As Eric had mentioned, people certainly matter, and those industries that are more highly affected by labor and people need to be close proximity to each other are the ones that are most highly affected. It's why we don't have restaurants open right now. Distribution centers involve people, although there is distancing opportunities, masks, those sorts of things. But again, we have huge distribution centers that require people and trucks and all those sorts of loading activities. Grocery stores have adapted, at least those that I have attended, all sorts of different measures to keep people from getting into too close proximity of each other, but certainly these are important aspects of continuing the process of moving food to people. So finally, I'm just going to stop and say that if we have luck at all on our side, and I hope we do, maybe by this late summer as we start seeing combines move into the field, start trying to produce some of that wheat that people are demanding now, hopefully things will be in a lot better situation, and some of these markets will probably start to adjust back upward, but it all depends upon how long of a process we're in for and the severity of that particular process. So with that, I will stop and see if I can answer any questions you might have, and if the questions are really, really hard, I'll just let Eric or Anton take care of them.
All right, well, thank you very much, Gary, for that presentation. Please take some time to send a question in there to the chat box while we've got Gary on the line. And while people are thinking of questions for Gary, I'll put a couple of evaluation questions up here on the screen. If you could take a second and fill those out with us, we'd appreciate that as well. All right, our first question here. Get this. Okay, organic and natural foods are staying on the shelves. Will this impact the growth on those segments? And
Okay, I'll take that one right now. You know, I think this is also temporary. When people's incomes return, which we fully intend that this will eventually dissipate and we will be back on track. You know, I think those normal buying habits of those who are very interested in, let's say, natural, organic, or whatever other products there might be, I suspect that those sectors won't lose their growth area and potential. But really, in all those products, these are really niche products. I mean, these are less than probably 5% of sales, total gross sales are in the organic market in the U.S. And as a result of that, it's still a small component, important component. It's a fantastic component. It's something that people, if they want, folks are willing to go out and produce those products, and I think that's terrific. But they are also more expensive. Most of the time, twice as expensive. And as a result, when incomes lag, it's another just like the beef industry is going to struggle until we get incomes back up and travel moving around. I think those kind of products will also suffer for the short term. And probably return to where they were once things get back to normal.
All right, thanks, Gary. We've got a second question here I'd like you to try to tackle. It says, will canneries and packing plants shift to consumer-side portions and cuts for retail? And if so, when everything gets back to normal, how long will it take for them to once again reshift their focus?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And these plants do, and they will. You have to remember, if you're going to fill a smaller can, you have to have the cans available. And if you have a plant that half the can's been big and half been small, that takes a while. But there's enough of a profit motive for people to run these plants as efficiently as they can, and they'll make some adjustments, sure. How long will it last? Well, it'll last until we open up the restaurants again and food service, including things like universities and schools, all those kinds of places that have products that they will once again use in the larger sizes. So people get pretty clever at how to make these changes. Sometimes it's not immediately because of other input needs, like I said, of can sizes or whatever. And you have to also remember that as we shift food now into the grocery stores, they have an inventory control problem because they're not used to feeding nearly or moving nearly the quantity of product through those stores. But when you shut down food service and more has to go through there, they have to deal with inventory, and they have people involved, and cold storage holdings are limited, and all those sorts of things. Probably the bigger problem, as I see a question there, Joel, involves, and this is related, what do you expect the biggest problems with? Vegetables, meat, or bread products, and the vegetable problem is really one of labor to get things harvested. The meat problem, Eric has talked about at length, but there's a little longer supply chain problem there, and that is poultry, chickens are ready to be slaughtered, and if the plants aren't open, then those animals will never make it to market. We have hogs and cattle that are that are ready to be slaughtered now, and these are things that you just don't slow down. You can slow down a little bit, but you don't slow down the fact that these animals are ready for harvest now. So the longer this goes on, these two questions are related, the more those kinds of things that have a sort of a longer supply chain and have more people involved, those are the products that are going to be more difficult to obtain down the road. That doesn't mean there won't be enough there, but it will take quite a bit of adjustment to get these things lined up and working unless we can get through this this people problem with COVID-19.
All right, and Gary, they're still coming in, so I'm going to keep asking you, even if we're running.
That's fine. Yeah. I'm just sitting here in my bunny slippers. This is what I'm going to do today.
And I know we wanted to circle back to Eric for a question as well, but let's go with this one. Is there any data coming about these local and regional food economies, and impact on these localized markets? Organics fill a big role in direct marketing opportunities for these customers and some local restaurants.
Yeah, I to answer the question first, I haven't seen any data. It's probably way too early. So many of the farmers markets, sort of local market sort of things, will be starting down south, about this time or in a month or two. But that really is a market that just isn't going to occur until these the orders are moved, until we're allowed to safely move around and congregate. I mean, one of the major features of a farmer's market, of course, is that there's lots of people there, and it's an event, and people go to talk to other people and to buy fresh food and all those sorts of things. But if you're not allowed to congregate, these things aren't going to happen. So for those folks that are really count on their incomes coming from that, it's going to be a tough year if these sort of restrictions continue. If the restrictions are lifted, meaning it's safe for us to do that, those things will bounce back really quickly.
Okay, thank you much for that one. Let's get one more, and then we'll jump over to Eric and pick up a question we had a little bit earlier. How are supply chains issues affecting provisions of stable goods within Montana, particularly for more rural communities?
Yeah, right now, in Montana, of course, most of the calves that are on the ground will be pastured all summer, and so we're really looking towards the fall when those animals are needed. As Eric mentioned, if this thing is over by then, I fully expect those cattle prices to be back to where they were, or expected prices were a few months ago. A lot just depends upon the length of time. In terms of crops, we're really talking about wheat. And again, as far as producers go, wheat at least is one of the less labor-intensive industries in terms of distribution and supply chains. But I think the big thing is, will we have ports open, and will other countries want wheat? About 50% of all the wheat produced in the United States, a much larger percentage of that than produced in Montana, goes to other countries. And so the trade aspect is very important on that supply chain end of things for wheat producers. But I don't think there's any real problem in getting the wheat put in the ground, getting it harvested. The question is, what will the market look like? And a lot of that depends upon trade.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Gary, for sharing some light on those questions. I'm going to jump back to Eric. We had some questions come in earlier that we didn't get all the way through, and I'm going to actually ask two of them sort of together to him and let him answer them in one shot. So the first one is, we were talking about meat prices earlier and some of the impacts here recently. So does some of this alternative meat, fake meat, or Beyond Meat follow the same kind of price trends that we've been seeing in the traditional meat markets? And then two, do you want to talk a little bit about calf price projections for fall?
Yeah, thanks, Joel. So on at least with Beyond Meat, we don't have a futures market, but we can look at the valuation of the company, which has fallen by quite a bit since some of the first few cases. And it's for some of the same reasons as we've seen in beef. A lot of the expansion of especially Beyond Meat has relied on restaurants, and with those being shut down, a lot of that expansion is gone. They don't really have the same supply bottlenecks that we see at some of the big processing facilities, but the revenue projections are down, and it's, I would anticipate it's a short run blip, just given that it's mostly based on the shutting down restaurants and slowing down fast food for temporary consumption. And then the other question, Joel, I don't know if I quite understood that, was on calf price projections. Is that right?
Yeah, just did you have any thoughts on what calf prices might be doing this fall beyond what you showed us a little bit earlier?
Yeah, I've been waiting for some data to come out to look at some of the basis changes on what the impact of some of these outbreaks have had. And I guess I haven't been able to see any of that data yet. But, I would anticipate at least projections right now. And again, I keep talking about the futures market. The way to think about that is just with the market we have today, that's sort of what's priced in there. So if anything happens that's unexpected between now and fall, then we can see some change in those prices. Right now, there's a projection of prices to be a little bit higher than they are now, but lower than kind of where they were a couple months ago. Given that, you could have, what kind of expectations are there for what the economy will look like in the fall? What are they anticipated to look like in the fall? And I think there's probably some likelihood of some resurgence of COVID baked into those projections. But, if there were something that happened unexpected, obviously we'd see some downside. And it's likely that most of the risk is on the downside at this point. I can't really think of the markets really coming back in a quick fashion. So I do think a lot of the sort of uncertainty is probably to the downside of the price right now.
All right. Thank you very much, Eric. I think we've gotten through the bulk of the questions that I'm seeing here over on the question and answer pod. So thank you, everybody, for sending in some great questions today, and thanks for joining us. If you haven't marked your calendars for a week from today, we've got the topics here up on the screen. We'll be talking a little more about some labor issues related to what's currently going on in the economy. And then we did extend the series for 2 weeks from today. We'll also have some speakers on there as well, and one of them is going to talk about agricultural land prices. And we've still got some others that we're working on narrowing down some titles for as well. So, but do mark your calendars if you haven't for 2 weeks from today. So with that, thank you to all three of my speakers today, and thank you all for joining us, and I hope to see you in 1 week.